So now we look at kind of the international outcomes of the post-World War II period and the impacts of the Cold War on this, and where the United States intervenes. So when we're looking at the end of World War II, we look at one, Germany, right? The Nazi regime is out, and so there's a vacuum of power there, and the United States is going to come in there and start to rebuild and begin to rebuild a government that is pro-US. At the same time, and they're allied with France and Great Britain or the UK. At the same time, USSR, or Soviet Union, is like, well, no, we're going to be involved too. And so they're arguing, right? They're in a Cold War, and they initially divide Germany into 4 zones that are going to be overseen by the 4 kind of major powers that won World War II: the US, France, Great Britain, or United Kingdom, and Soviet Russia. They each get a section of Germany that they're going to oversee the rebuilding of. And eventually, the US, France, and the United Kingdom, their zone consolidates down into West Germany, and the Soviet side becomes East Germany. And this is when the Berlin Wall goes up. And so in Berlin, Germany, you have a wall go up, right, as a visual kind of marker of where on the west of Berlin and West Germany, it is pro-US, open to capitalism and so on. And then to the east of that wall, East Berlin and East Germany are Soviet controlled. And so it becomes communist. That's the communist Germany versus the capitalist Germany on the other side. You also have a major move that we still are feeling the impacts of today. In 1947, Palestine, which was a country, was taken over by kind of like this united group of people that are rebuilding the world after World War II, and they decide that they are going to turn Palestine into Israel, and Israel gets created. Right, it didn't exist before this, so it gets created and turned into an ethno-religious state. It's going to be a Jewish nation, as a way to address, the fact that the Jewish people are a diaspora without a homeland, right? A diaspora, like a group of people that are kind of like in all these different countries around the world, and they don't have a homeland. And so there was this idea like, well, that contributed to something like the Holocaust, where there's no nation to protect these folks, right? But we can also look at, of course, Israel as being kind of created by these Western powers as being the only pro-West nation in the Middle East, right? And it's created by rounding up and removing Palestinian people and taking away their nation and citizenship in order to create a Israeli nation. So immediately after it was created, or with this talk of this creation, you had resistance from the Arab League. And so the Arab League was a league of nations, of Arab nations in the Middle East, who were saying, no, this is a human rights violation for the Palestinian people. You're removing an indigenous group of people to create the settler state. And it was clear that, and it's been clear since, that the United States has invested a lot of money into Israel, and there's a lot of connection between the U.S. Government and the Israeli government, the U.S. military and the Israeli military, and so this is something that comes out of World War II, but we're still feeling the impact of today. Then in 1949, China has a communist revolution, and the former government of the Republic of China. So the Republic of China is the China that existed, that was a somewhat pro-West, right? They were on the side of the Allies in World War II, a pro-West kind of Western democracy kind of government. They get overthrown by a communist revolution, and then that's Mao Zedong, right? And they throw out these folks, and they're going to reclaim China for the Chinese and establish this communist system. The Republic of China fled to the island country of Taiwan. And so Taiwan was its own country with its own indigenous people, kind of off the coast, right? And the Republic of China, Chiang Kai-shek, who was the leader, sets up his Republic of China government in Taiwan. and they began to build a nation there, people who have fled from communist China. And so you have Taiwanese people that are ethnically Taiwanese, and then you have Chinese people who are from Taiwan. And so like you have all these shiftings of people and establishments of nations in different places, right? And so it's a lot of change going on after like a very monumental world conflict. As I mentioned, Korea was a Japanese colony, and as soon as Japan surrenders in the war, now this, the places that once were occupied by Japan are now again up for grabs. And so the Korean people see this as finally decades and decades and decades of being colonized by Japan, of being treated as second-class citizens, of not having the right to rule ourselves. Now we get a chance to have an independent Korean nation and rule ourselves. But immediately, both the United States and the Soviet Union moved in and began manipulating kind of how Korea was going to develop. And they began arguing over, is Korea going to be communist, or is it going to be Western capitalist, right? Is it which side is it going to go? And this is where we have the Korean War. And the Korean War happened from 1950 to 1953 and ends with, okay, well, let's just, we're going to just divide the Korean nation into a north and south. The north part will be allied with the Soviet Union. The south part will be allied with the US. Forget what the Korean people want, which is a united Korea ruled by themselves. This is what's going to happen. So again, we see that sense of entitlement to decide what happens in other people's countries. We're going to see that replay over and over again, even though this is not the time of colonialism, right? And everyone's talking about freedom and democracy, or the rights of the people to not be oppressed, and blah, blah, blah on both sides. The reality on the ground is it's just kind of shifting kind of power around, or who's in charge around. Then in 10 years after the Chinese Communist Revolution in Cuba, you have the Cuban Communist Revolution, again, where the Cuban elite government that was very much aligned with United States business interests gets thrown out by the Communist Revolution. A lot of Cuban people flee to the United States, right, because Florida is very close to Cuba. The communist government takes over. The United States cuts relations with Cuba as a result. All of this coming out of World War II, where we had this war industry develop and make a lot of money. Now with the Cold War, you still have justification to keep the war industry going. And not only keep the war industry going, but to develop it much more. With all the talk of like the Soviet Union and nuclear war, now you have immense amounts of funding going into like never before into the military. And not only are you funding the military, you have the development of what's called the military industrial complex, where now it's not just, tax dollars paying for munitions and supplies and stuff and paying for soldiers. Now you're going to have this relationship of defense contractors and major corporations who are going to spend millions and millions of dollars on lobbyists who are going to elect the representatives they want, that they feel will support the growth of these war industries. You have government agencies that get created to kind of oversee this and to develop this type of industry. You also have in 1947, during this period, the creation of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, with the major goal of collecting information initially about the Soviet Union, right? And collecting information like, spying, espionage, all of that. But then eventually grows into orchestrating interventions and trying to control and monitor kind of political leanings of different groups in different countries. And the CIA really gets heavily involved around the world, but especially in the Middle East and in Latin America, in terms of interventions in local elections, in kind of military actions, in rebellions and revolutions. And we see that play out in a number of ways that impacts not only the people in that country, but people around the world and here in the United States. in the 1950s and 60s, as a result of this Cold War kind of need, or the idea that there's this need for these kinds of military developments, the U.S. intervenes in Syria, Iran, Guatemala, Korea, Cuba, Tibet, Dominican Republic, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Indonesia, Congo, and many more. You look at almost any place in the world during this time, and you can see some imprint of, or a lot of evidence of U.S. involvement, especially when there was any kind of socialist or communist party or candidates, or kind of what could be considered a threat. All right, so that takes us to our writing assignment for this week, writing assignment number 11. You are going to read about the Korean War in the textbook and answer these 3 questions about the Korean War. And then we're going to look at another impact of World War II and the Cold War is once World War II ends, and World War II was all about, right, fighting fascism and giving people the right to rule themselves and not having dictators over you. And then in the Cold War period, we're talking about we don't want, communism ruling over people. And then the communists are talking about you don't want capitalism oppressing you. So all this talk about like liberation and freedom. Well, you can't be talking about all that stuff and not have people actually say, well, yeah, that's what we want. So you have all of these colonies in the British Empire, in the French Empire, and even in the U.S. Empire saying, well, what about us? Right? You just talked about we're fighting for the freedom of like Poland to not be invaded by Germany. Well, what about the right of Vietnam not to be ruled by France? Or, Nigeria not to be ruled by Great Britain? Or Guam not to be ruled by the United States? Puerto Rico not to be ruled by the United States? So you have this kind of wave of liberationist movements, right? Independence movements throughout the world. So you have first kind of the Philippines. Remember, the U.S. was holding the Philippines as its territory since 1899, right? With the Spanish-American War. It's in a position where the Filipinos fought in World War II. There were Filipino soldiers fighting for the United States, but they couldn't become U.S. citizens, right? So it's like it became very like highlighted. The United States keeps talking about the right of people to rule themselves. And so eventually the U.S. is like, okay, well, yeah, we should probably let go of the Philippines. It's not a good look for us. And so they release the Philippines, and the Philippines becomes an independent nation after almost 50 years of U.S. Occupation. The following year, in 1947, India gains its independence from Britain. Britain had colonized India. Britain had not formally colonized Iran, but essentially ruled Iran as a territory. And then Iran became independent from British colonial control in 1951. Following the end of World War II, right, France was really heavily destroyed in World War II. And so France's colonies in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, and then Cambodia and Laos, which used to be called French Indochina, those 3 countries. They were like, okay, well, here's our opportunity, right? France, you just fought this war against, fascism. The United States, you're fighting for like independence and democracy. Vietnam's like, here's our chance now. We're going to get our freedom. And so the leaders of Vietnam actually approached the United States and said, hey, we want independence. Can you help us? We're going to model our Declaration of Independence after the U.S. Declaration of Independence. But the U.S. could not support Vietnamese independence because the U.S. is friends with France. And France is like, we cannot let go of these colonies. We are going to depend on the money we get from these colonies to help rebuild France from the war. So we desperately need to keep these colonies under our control. So Vietnam is like, we want freedom like the USA. And the USA is saying, we are defending freedom around the world. And yet, the US ends up siding with France. And they support France in a fight to keep Vietnam as a colony. France loses in 1954. And the Vietnamese people are like, yay, we're free, we're independent, just like Korea. But of course, just like with Korea, the Vietnamese people are not able to have their independence because almost immediately the US intervenes on behalf of France, and then the Soviet Union steps in, and now you have Vietnam get divided into North and South Vietnam, just like Korea got divided into North and South Korea. One side, the North, being allied with Russia, the South being allied with the United States, and then the war ensues from there. Throughout Africa, which has been heavily colonized, throughout the 1800s by Britain, by France, by Portugal, by the Netherlands, by Belgium, by Italy, by they're finally going to get these independence movements going. So you have Algeria, Madagascar, Nigeria, Congo, Kenya, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, all have independence movements. And there's like this like little doorway of kind of a new day, right? A new potential. It's not going to last long, but there is that, initial push for like, wow, we can be free now. As we're going to see in later lectures, the U.S. and European colonial powers are not going to let these colonies go so easily, and they're going to find, just like we see with the U.S. and the end of slavery, find other ways to keep the same old systems going. All right, so that takes us to our next, or the last part of our writing assignment for this week. Coming back to the United States, while all of this is happening in the world, you end up with what's called the Red Scare in the United States. You're going to read about the second Red Scare and a man named Joseph McCarthy, and you're going to answer these 3 questions about communism and the way that people addressed it in the United States.